Welcome, everybody, to Soccer 101. My name is Taylor Rockwell, and this week we have an episode that could probably be an hour and a half long, but I have to be out of here in about 30 minutes, so we're going to do our best to get it in under time. But, Graham, we're talking about the special one himself, the legend, I think still a legend, the Jose Mourinho. How you doing, Graham?
Hello, Taylor Rockwell. Yes, very much a legend in his own mind, still.
For sure.
I would argue still a legend of management, but that memory of what made him a legend is starting to fade a little bit. And that's why I think this episode works. I think this is why this is a good one-on-one topic. Because if you weren't a soccer fan 15 years ago, you might be a bit confused by the fascination around Jose Mourinho, because the last 15 years for him haven't been so glorious. His last three jobs have been Benfica, which he's just taken in the last week as we're recording, Fenerbahce, and Roma. Big clubs, but not the resume of someone you would consider a tier 1 manager. But Jose Mourinho was a force of nature for the best part of a decade. He won the Champions League twice with two unfancied teams. More on that later. He had the charisma. He had the quotes. He was good looking as well. And even people like Ferguson and Wenger really feared him for a time. So I think it's very much worth going back and recapping some of his great moments.
Yeah, and so to set that stage, Graham, you've done a good job of it. But like for me personally, you said like Ferguson was afraid of him. He is one of two managers that I actively feared when my team played against, because it felt like there is no way to beat this guy. There is no way to figure his teams out. There's no way to get through them. Specifically with that first spell with Chelsea is the one that I just remember being like, well, that's that. I don't know how you get through this. And then when he gets sacked, that's the first sacking I remember being completely dumbfounded by. Like, how do you sack the person that made you unbeatable? How do you sack this ridiculously talented manager? Does that open up the whole league for everybody else? It kind of feels like it does. And it also kind of sets the stage for the 2 to 3 year cycle for Jose Mourinho that we came to know and then came to kind of maybe fall by the wayside, because it ended up being 1 or 2 year cycles for him as time goes on.
Yeah, I mean, there's a period in Mourinho's career where everything he touches just turns to gold, right? Yep. It starts with Porto, it then leads to Chelsea, where he doesn't win the Champions League with Chelsea, but he completely reshapes the landscape of English soccer. He then goes to Inter Milan, wins the Champions League with them. And then laterally, there's Real Madrid, which felt like his career had been building up to that moment, where there's the personal rivalry with Barcelona and Pep Guardiola. I think we should get into that more later in this episode, because that's kind of the crux of the Mourinho lore right there. And he was successful at Real Madrid, but after that it felt like Real Madrid changed him a little bit. And so I think there's a before Real Madrid and there's an after Real Madrid, and I think in this episode we're maybe going to look more at the before Real Madrid and Real Madrid as well, just because that's when he was he was at his prime, and he was, I've said it before, a force of nature. I think when Joe is a little bit confused about Jose Mourinho, I have to remind myself he lacks that context of when Mourinho just arrived on the scene and he was just incredible, and he was the best manager that we'd ever seen at that point for a time.
I really want to ask you more about Real Madrid changing him, but we'll get to that, I suppose, because let's start with his origin story. Father, a former professional who became a coach. Mourinho himself grew up around coaching, was an okay footballer by all accounts. I think he played like semi-pro, which to me means he played at a very low level when he was younger. Studies sports science, took coaching courses, but it's the relationship/connection to Bobby Robson, Sir Bobby Robson, to give him his proper billing, that kind of starts Mourinho down the path where he finds himself today.
Yeah, and that's his first big break, as he gets a job to work as a translator, originally for Sporting when Bobby Robson is the manager. Robson takes Mourinho under his wing, and even though Mourinho's job is a translator, that's what he's paid for initially, Robson recognises that this young guy has a sharp tactical mind, and when Robson goes to Porto, he takes Mourinho with him, and he also takes him to Barcelona. And that's the next big sort of phase in Mourinho's fledgling career at that point. And it's such a big part of the Mourinho lore, because it's at Barcelona where Mourinho starts to develop that famous chip on his shoulder. Because Robson, he would let Mourinho take some coaching sessions. And the story goes that the Barcelona players didn't like that, because they didn't see Mourinho as one of their own. He didn't come through La Masia. He wasn't a Cruyff disciple. And who was one of those Barcelona players at that time that Mourinho would be coaching in those sessions? Pep Guardiola. And so after Robson leaves, Mourinho then works under Louis van Gaal as well, who he credits with being a really important figure in his career as well. But after that, he embarks on his own managerial career. But that grounding at Barcelona is so key to understanding the manager that he would later become.
Yeah. And the story when he first meets Bobby Robson is really interesting because, as I understand it, basically Robson is asking around for a translator and is told about this like young coach who's fluent in both Portuguese and English but has some interesting ideas, calls him up in the middle of the night, schedules the interview, is impressed by the footballing knowledge. And what I thought was really interesting is that a specific thing that multiple people talked about with Mourinho at this time period is he is fluent in English and Portuguese and maybe Spanish too, I forget. But regardless, the thing that I think is noted is that he's adept at explaining tactical ideas in multiple languages, which is apparently very difficult. And I can see how it would be, that you have to kind of get the right turn of phrase. You have to be able to communicate the exact thing you need in the exact wording. And I think that goes a long way towards explaining like his clarity of instruction as a manager and how he got to be so good at relaying in-game instructions, in making adjustments at halftime, which were kind of hallmarks of him when he breaks through with Porto and then with Chelsea, that he is able to kind of get his team to shift what they're doing really, really quickly. And I think a lot of that has to do with his abilities as a communicator. So you're totally right there, Graham. We've got the Bobby Robson, we've got the Louis van Gaal. Then he sets out on his own. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so he has a couple of managerial jobs to start out before he gets to Porto, which is kind of the next big watershed moment for him. So he's Benfica manager in 2000.
Which I completely forgot about it when we were discussing this last time, yeah.
So he's not there for long. He's there until the end of the season. Actually does quite well there. Interestingly enough, I didn't know this. Robson at the same time offers Mourinho the Newcastle assistant job, and the pitch was that this is how highly Bobby Robson liked Mourinho. The pitch was Mourinho would come in, be the assistant, and then 2 years down the line, Mourinho would take over at Newcastle. So there's a couple of sliding doors moments here. That's one sliding door moment. The other one is that the Porto story that eventually unfolds a couple years later could have been the Benfica story, because he was theirs. He was Benfica manager. Benfica at the time were having a presidential election, and the president who ultimately won that election had, as people will know, this is the case in like Iberia and Spain and Portugal, those presidential candidates, they'll make promises. If I'm president, I'll sign this player, I'll appoint this manager. And so the guy who ended up winning had sort of committed to another manager, and so Mourinho left, and he takes over União de Lira, which is a much smaller team in Portugal, but he gets them competing against some of the biggest teams in Portugal at that time and gets the attention of Porto, and he gets the Porto job, and that really is what puts him on the map, because obviously he wins 2 European trophies there. I vividly remember Porto winning the UEFA Cup because they played Celtic in that final. That game was such a formative experience for me as a young football fan. It was such a huge deal in Scotland. Like, there's documentaries about that game and that run from Celtic, from Celtic in that tournament. And so I got a preview of what was to come from Mourinho, because I remember all the outrage about the time wasting and the play acting and how Martin O'Neill was furious with the antics of Porto, and basically Celtic got Mourinho'd before a lot of other teams in Europe got Mourinho'd, and Porto were compact, they were organised, but they were also, they weren't boring or dull to watch, Porto. They were so emphatic and forceful at attacking teams when the opportunity was there, and they won that game 3-2, I think, as the end scoreline in that game. So it was an exciting game. And then, of course, the following season, Porto also win the Champions League, and the catalyst for that is the famous game at Old Trafford, where they beat Manchester United with a late winner, and Mourinho goes sprinting down the touchline to celebrate, and from that moment, the English media are obsessed with Mourinho. They know exactly who he is. He obviously goes on to win the Champions League, and that puts him on the map as one of the best managers of his generation.
I still kind of think it's the sprint down the touchline after beating Manchester United that appeals to Roman Abramovich at Chelsea. Certainly it's winning the Champions League, don't get me wrong. But I feel like that moment of like, I could hire that guy who won the Champions League and also like annoyed my rival for the title and seems to have annoyed all of English media. Yeah, let's do that. And I think it sort of, I think occasionally gets not quite dismissed, because it is one of Mourinho's crowning achievements. I'm not sure it is the crowning achievement, but it's up there. But I think it's sometimes dismissed as like, yeah, that was like Porto versus Monaco. Real Madrid, Arsenal, Milan, and Barcelona were all eliminated earlier. So Porto beat Manchester United in the round of 16, Lyon, Deportivo La Coruña, and Monaco in the final. So there's a perception that like, well, they didn't have to play that many elite teams. But I think that dismisses so much of what you've already talked about, Graham, where you have this team that is incredibly well drilled, defensively solid, deadly on the counterattack. They understand their formation and system, but also that formation and the system can be adjusted to some extent. But then Mourinho is using very detailed opposition analysis. He's giving player-specific instructions in multiple languages. He's making mid-game adjustments, which weren't like necessarily cutting-edge advancements, but they are still very much advancements in approaches to coaching for the time. And as you mentioned, having already won the UEFA Cup in 2003, it's like almost entirely the same team with a few additions. And so there's this kind of, they've already gone through a knockout competition and won. They've already understood the pressure and what you have to do to get that win. And so to do it again is a remarkable feat, but you can also see how things built to that moment.
Yeah, the thing that Mourinho really pioneered was this method of training called periodization, easy for me to say. And basically it's this idea of, until then, it was common practice to separate your technical and your tactical drills out into individual sessions, and periodization is basically mixing them together into the same sessions. And so Mourinho was a big believer in that. The other thing that Mourinho was great at was he would set up by... His starting point would be he would look at how the opponents would play, and then he would work back to how his teams should set up against that team. And that surely comes from his background as like a scout. He worked as a scout for a number of these clubs in his early days. Mm-hmm. So I think his prep was really, really good. And that Manchester United game in particular, he had specific ideas of how to stop Manchester United playing. I take your point, Taylor, on like if you look at that run, some of the teams besides Manchester United are maybe not superpowers to this day. At the same time, you've got Lyon, who are the French champions in the quarter-final. You've then got Deportivo La Coruña, who are the Spanish champions at that time. So it was a weird period in European football where maybe some of the big powers were not at the top of the domestic game. So I would kind of contend that they didn't have like tough games. They did. They maybe didn't have like the biggest clubs they were playing against. But I actually do think this is... I mean, maybe skipping ahead here, Inter Milan is the other one you would look at and think that's his greatest achievement.
There's one more that I'm sincere about.
I'm interested. But is it Manchester United finish in second place?
Yes, it is.
All right, okay, there we go. We'll get to that. I just think, I don't know if we'll ever see a team outside the big five leagues win the Champions League. Maybe it will happen again. I don't know if we'll see it in the way that Mourinho did it with Porto, where it just legitimately felt like he'd gamed the system. He'd figured out a way to get the better of everyone else in Europe, and it wasn't a fluke at all, as proven by the fact that they went back-to-back. They did the UEFA Cup, and then next season they went and did the Champions League. I don't know if we'll ever see that again.
You mentioned the chip on the shoulder earlier in the show, and I think that is like a really important point to touch on and keep going back to with Jose Mourinho, because I also think from the Porto, I know from the Porto victories he gets the Chelsea gig, but I think maybe privately it's a very different story, but I think Sir Alex Ferguson and maybe other managers still sort of dismiss him even at this moment. I think there is an idea that like, you got lucky, you figured this out, whatever. But I do think it takes that first season in England for I think coaches to fully realize like we are dealing with a new entity, both in terms of personality and the way he deals with media, but also in terms of how tactically he prepared he is for every single game and how like strong of a reaction he is able to get from his players. And it's at that Chelsea unveiling that we get the famous quote that I think has sort of been moved into
a little bit.
It gets moved, yeah, because it's like what? Like Vader doesn't really say like Luke, I am your father. He says like he says something like that, but it gets kind of shortened into that. Or like, we're going to need a bigger boat, I think isn't exactly what's said either. Same thing. He doesn't say, I am the special one. He says, I think I am a special one. But right? Please don't call me arrogant, but I'm European champion, and I think I'm a special one. Which I think immediately is such a like very specific turn of phrase, and spoken in English, obviously, that like just sort of, I think, it gets a reaction. It creates more of a fascination. He already has a little bit of that controversial fascination from the touchline run and from the interactions that you mentioned previously in Scotland. And I feel like he just immediately, I wouldn't say he's a media darling, but he seems to be a thing that is going to get clicks, that is going to get headlines, that is going to sell papers at that time. And so I think the fascination really kind of escalates from there.
I absolutely would say he was a media darling. I think they were eaten out of his hand for about 3 seasons, the English media. I mean, he's just a tsunami of quotes and charisma. And you're right, Taylor. That special one thing,
specialist in failure about Arsene Wenger. That's
so
such
many
a bomb.
Called him call him a voyeur as well or something?
Yeah,
I mean, there was some things
because he was obsessed with what Chelsea was doing, and like, why is he always so interested in our training and what we're doing? He's a voyeur. Yeah.
Honestly, like Mourinho, it was a quote, a press conference. There were so many. I mean, one of my favourite ones is when he's talking about. He was complaining about the signings that Chelsea had made, which ultimately is what led to him leaving, was sort of disgruntlement with Roman Abramovich. But he was talking about, if I don't go to Waitrose to get the right eggs, then I can't make the omelette. I can't make the best omelette. There's just so many things like that from Mourinho. The interesting thing about him getting the Chelsea job is that Chelsea, the story goes that they basically decided on the basis of that Champions League final between Monaco and Porto who they were going to appoint. So that's another sliding doors moment, as the other manager's Didier Deschamps for Monaco. How do things go if it's Didier Deschamps? And the story also goes that if it wasn't Chelsea, it was going to be Liverpool. Liverpool had held talks with Mourinho, which is interesting that obviously there's then a rivalry with Liverpool and when Mourinho's there with Rafa Benitez. So there's a million sliding door moments here with Mourinho, but he enters English football at a time when Ferguson and Wenger are the dominant figures, and he completely upends that. Chelsea win the Premier League in Mourinho's first season. They do it at a canter. I think people sleep on how good that Chelsea team was in Mourinho's first season. They set a new points record of 95 points, which was unheard of at the time. Teams were winning titles with like 79 points, 78 points before that. I think the reason they're slept on a bit is because their strength was in defence and organisation. They conceded just 15 goals in 38 games that season. And so I think we just generally, as football fans, romanticise attack-minded teams more. But that Chelsea team was incredible. And they had such like absolute pillars in that team, like John Terry, Frank Lampard, Petr Cech, Ashley Cole, some of the best players in Premier League history. And Mourinho was at the head of that as the figurehead of the whole Chelsea project, as it was at that time. Keep in mind, these were the early years of the Roman Abramovich tenure.
Is Didier Drogba in that first season, or does he come later?
I think he signed later. If he was in that team at that point, he hadn't quite reached the heights. Because the moment that propels Drogba, as I remember, Shevchenko joins Chelsea, and that little bit of competition just takes Drogba to an entirely new level. So I don't think he was quite in. If he was a Chelsea player that season, he wasn't quite the Drogba that he would become. Roman
Abramovich loved shoehorning in strikers, didn't he? That was just his favorite thing. Let's sign some more and see what happens. And you have also Ricardo Carvalho, who I think predates Mourinho, or is it around the same time that he comes in?
No, he's one.
Chelsea? Okay, he's
one of his early signings. Yeah. Carvalho comes in. Some of the other players that moved on from Porto, like Deco went to Barcelona.
Yeah.
I think Maniche ends up coming to Chelsea as well. Oh, Paulo Ferreira. That's the other one I'm thinking of. He becomes a key player for Chelsea under Mourinho.
Carvalho and Terry in their prime. That's quite the pairing. And I remember just Drogba being unstoppable. I remember he has a shot from like 30 yards out and like almost on the sideline, and the commentator like laughing in admiration and saying like, that's an audacious, like unacceptable shot from anybody but Didier Drogba.
Is that the one that kind of swerves away and goes like into the corner?
I think it might even have just been like saved or like pushed over for a corner, but I just remember it vividly as being this sort of moment where like this Chelsea team is able to just do ridiculous things out of nowhere, and everyone just sort of was like, yeah, that seems like kind of how this is going, which again I think is why in the moment it felt unbelievable that he ends up leaving when he does. And I remember it being this just kind of weird, very terse like posting on the Chelsea website of like Jose Mourinho has parted ways with the club, period. Like it was very brief, not much more than that, I don't think. And it just felt impossible in the moment because it felt like this was going to be a dynasty. I don't know how teams are able to compete with this. I don't know how teams overcome it. And then to kind of know what we know now is to know that that's kind of the cycle with Jose, that even if he is, by all accounts, privately like the nicest person and very affable and very charming, publicly he's going to have frustrations and fallouts, usually with decision makers, usually pointing fingers at other people when things don't go well for him or when he feels frustration for a lack of acquisitions or expenditure. And that is very much how this one ends with him and Chelsea the first go round, and I guess the second go round too.
Yeah, this is us establishing the pattern with Mourinho already, and it continues when he goes to Inter Milan, where he's obviously only there for a couple seasons. But what a couple seasons he has at Inter Milan. So he's appointed there in the summer of 2008, which was a big get for them because similar to how it is now, Italian football wasn't quite at the level of La Liga or the Premier League. But Marotta, the Inter president, he makes a big play to get Mourinho. And so he comes in for the 2008-2009 season with the stated aim of winning the Champions League. Because Inter are this club at this point. They pride themselves on European success. They were a dominant force in, I think, the 60s. They won like a bunch of European Cups. But they hadn't won the European Cup in such a long time, or the Champions League in such a long time. And so that was the aim for Mourinho. He wins Serie A in his first season, but it builds to this second season in 2009.
That's the one when they win it. Like the story is that he tells employees like not to celebrate so much because we haven't won anything yet. We know what we need to do. And
that sounds about right because it was all about winning more and it was all about succeeding in Europe. So it builds to this second season, and he handpicks his signings for that season. This is, I guess, in the pre-sporting director age. And so he wants Lucio from Bayern Munich for some speed at the back. He gets Wesley Sneijder for some midfield creativity. And he gets Diego Milito, the sort of like unconventional, underappreciated striker from Genoa who Mourinho likes and believes he can offer something. And of course, all three of those players were integral for Inter as they go on to win the treble, including that famous Champions League in 2010. And when we're talking about winning the Champions League in 2010, we have to mention that semi-final against Barcelona, because that's an important part of the Mourinho lore. And we also have to understand the subtext to that game, which is, as I've mentioned already, that chip in the shoulder that comes from his time at Barcelona. But in addition to that, before taking over at Inter, Mourinho interviews for the Barcelona job, and he sees it as this opportunity to go back to the club and really prove himself. And it gets down to Mourinho and Pep Guardiola, who at the time has only ever coached the B team. Mourinho, on the other hand, is the best manager in the world at that time. But Barca go for Pep because he's the embodiment of their values. And once again, Mourinho is seen as an outsider and he's not one of them. And that just adds to the chip on his shoulder. And so naturally, because this is how football goes with the luck of these things, Inter and Barca are drawn together in the Champions League semi-finals. Barca are the defending champions. They're the team to beat. Inter beat them handily in the first leg, 3-1. But then they go back to the Camp Nou for the return. I think this is one of the most famous games of all time. Inter go down to 10 men really early on in that game. Thiago Motta gets sent off. And this is the moment Mourinho fully tilts into becoming the Dark Lord. He says, well, if I'm not seen as one of you, I'm going to become everything that you despise and I'm going to beat you doing it. And Inter play the rest of the game with their back to the wall. They're down a man. It's defence versus attack.
Eto'o playing like wing-back, right?
Yeah,
like it's an ultra-defensive display.
Totally. And Inter squeak through, at which point Mourinho goes sprinting across the pitch at full time. Yeah. He says that he is pointing up to Marotta, the Inter president, to say, see, I told you we're in the final. But sitting next to Marotta are all the Barcelona executives who passed him over for that job. We all know who he's pointing to. He's pointing to them. And that moment is made even better by Barcelona turning on the sprinklers to try and get him off the pitch. If you look at all the pictures of the players celebrating, all the sprinklers are on, only in one half of the pitch as well, only in the Inter half of the pitch. It is one of the most iconic soccer moments and soccer games of all time, and I think that is like the peak of the Mourinho lore, where it's like he can do whatever he wants. He has taken on a club like Barcelona and he's won.
Pause on that one, because we're going to come back to that point. But a couple things for me. I remember the gap between him leaving Chelsea and taking the Inter gig. And I remember, I think it was Stephen Cohen on World Soccer Daily, or whatever the show was, basically saying, like, I have never felt a like specter hang over so many clubs when they are in trouble as Jose Mourinho, like, waiting to see what gig he'll take next, because he was so in demand, was so seen as like the manager to have, that anytime a club had a bit of a wobble, there was like, oh, Mourinho might take this one. So then he goes to Inter, and to your point, like, gets them to this Champions League final and the win. And it's another crazy moment because it's Inter with the treble going against Bayern, and if Bayern win, they get the treble. So it's him sort of seeing off Barca, then seeing off this really strong Bayern team. But this is a Barca team that were the defending Champions League winners. And so there, of course, at the time is this feeling of like, how do you beat this Barcelona team? And if you're Real Madrid, who haven't been able to do so, who do you look to do that? Well, here's the guy who's come in and done it, and then annoyed them at the same time, and they seem to truly hate. that's the guy we're going to go for, and that's exactly how this plays out. To Real Madrid goes Jose, and maybe Real Madrid breaks Jose, according to Graham?
Yeah, a little bit. So Mourinho, before that Champions League final, he already knows he's going to Real Madrid, and there's the famous scene of him leaving the... Interestingly enough, that final's played at the Bernabeu, but he leaves the stadium on his own, and we've all seen it, Marco Materazzi crying on his shoulder. And I think that was a good insight into what made Mourinho so powerful at that time, because his players loved him. It was like the cult of Mourinho if you were a player under him. But he doesn't go back to Milan. That's the last time he sees his players. He doesn't go back for the celebrations. He takes the Real Madrid job. And there was this sense that his career had been building up to this. This was the biggest club in the world, the club that had gone too long, as they saw it, without winning the Champions League. They were hiring the guy, of course, that had won the Champions League with like two unfancied teams. Like there was a sense he could just do it with anyone. And of course, it was the club where he would be free to indulge that grudge with Barcelona. And this era, is defined by the rivalry between Pep Guardiola and Mourinho. And what's interesting about this time is that Mourinho's shtick generally didn't work, at least not against Pep's great Barcelona team. There's the infamous 5-0 win for Barcelona in the Clásico. They also beat them convincingly in a Champions League semi-final over two-leg. And there's a point where Mourinho looks to be losing the plot. He does you remember the Tito Villanova poke in the eye on the touchline. He can't get near this Barcelona team, and we're seeing a different side to Mourinho here, where he's not in control of what's happening. He does have that 11-12 season where basically Mourinho completely changes tact, and he took the handbrake off Real Madrid. And Real Madrid in that season are an incredible attack-minded team that Mourinho wasn't really known for. They set a new points record by reaching 100 points that season. This is when Ronaldo, Benzema and Ozil are irresistible in that team. They basically beat Barcelona at their own game. But the way it unravels for Jose Mourinho, he just can't escape this. He becomes more paranoid. He becomes more sort of conspiratorial at this time, and some of the sort of like sparkle and the mischief, I think, disappears out of Mourinho during this Real Madrid stint, and so that's why I think that's sort of the turning point for him in his career.
I think it's also the moment when going up against Pep so often, and Pep and that Barca team having so much success, it is where you kind of see it fully shift into like, Pep's probably the best in the world, and it's the start of wondering like, Pep has this tiki-taka, proactive, passing, possession, beautiful soccer, sort of, if you enjoy 1-0 wins. Mourinho has 1-0 wins of his own, but they're much more defensive, much more sort of, like, the perception is, like, laborious and drawn out and less enjoyable, and I think that's where that sort of perception starts to change as well. And it's not as though Mourinho then just kind of falls by the wayside or anything like that. He has the return to Chelsea. They win the Premier League again with him in charge. But that, like, I remember him going back to Chelsea, and instead of it feeling like, here we go, we're going to pick up right where they left off, it felt sort of like, we'll see if this is going to work. Because to your point, it felt like maybe he lost the plot a little bit. And that's where it's kind of like, I think, fully cemented for me of he's going to do well, then he's going to do even better, and then it's going to kind of flame out spectacularly.
Yeah, I think his career path post-Real Madrid, he lost purpose, right? I think every time he took a job up until that point, there was a clear reason for why he was there. What's the purpose of him being at Porto or Chelsea or Inter or Real Madrid? When he goes back to Chelsea, it's kind of like, okay, we'll do this all over again. And so I don't think he has that purpose. As I say, I think he's changed a little bit as a person. He has maybe fallen behind the curve a little bit. I think he became so obsessed with Barcelona and Pep Guardiola and that team and toppling them that he failed to evolve his style of play. That he was left behind in that period. Pep is constantly evolving, even if he's going against like his own principles. Man City right now are much more direct than we've ever known them to be. They've got a robot up front and a man mountain in goal who can't pass the ball, but Pep continues to evolve in the way that Mourinho didn't. And so I think after Real Madrid, his career just kind of, it slides from one job to the next where it's not really clear what he's doing. You know, Manchester United, maybe there was a clear purpose at Manchester United where it was like, let's get this club up to the top, but he never had the tools to do that at United.
I think that's another sliding doors moment because he leaves Madrid in June of 2013. He immediately takes the Chelsea job. I think 2 days later he's appointed. But 2013 is when Ferguson steps away, right? And so there is that idea that like maybe that would have been the purpose of like, and that was the debate, right? And I kind of thought it was going to be Mourinho. It felt like the logical choice, even with some of the baggage we're already talking about. Ferguson supposedly prefers David Moyes. That's what the ownership does. But I do wonder if you bring in Jose Mourinho with his force of personality and the kind of like task of continuing on or building on from that, like that is a challenge. That is a thing that he can like work very hard to overcome, and then kind of challenge himself against Sir Alex Ferguson, who's no longer there, so you don't have to deal with him head on or anything like that. I do wonder how that would have gone, because by the time he does end up going there, after leaving Chelsea in December of 2015, goes to Manchester United in May of 2016, but that's when it feels like this is like Manchester United getting the guy they maybe should have gotten originally, but now we're kind of past that point. Manchester United seem like they are past the point. I don't know how well this is going to work out. And so there's excitement and enthusiasm, but there's also a feeling of this feels like kind of, I don't know, like two beautiful celebrities who should have dated when they were like 25 and made a beautiful baby, now dating when they're 35. No disrespect to 35-year-olds. I am older than that. But there's a feeling of like, this isn't quite what we were looking for, but we'll see what happens. And what happens is, I would say I think he has said finishing second that season is one of his most remarkable accomplishments, given the limitations. I think what we know about the club now, he might not be being disingenuous with that.
And that's right in the middle of the Ed Woodward era, so he has to contend with all that dysfunction at Manchester United. I totally agree, Taylor, in the 2013 sliding doors moment. I'd like to run that back. Like, can we just get an alternative view of what would have happened if it was Mourinho that would replace Ferguson? Does he just come in and his personality, the power of his personality, just sort of fixes things for Manchester United? I mean, I would predict something would go awry further down the line for that club with Ed Woodward running it and the Glazers. But would they been able to be successful for a little while under him? I think it's possible. But, by the time he gets to Spurs after Man United, what's he doing there? Like, what is the purpose of him being at Spurs? Spurs fans don't really want him there, just always felt like a weird fit. Then it's Roma, where he's adored for a period, won the Conference League.
Gets the tattoo.
They got the tattoo, yeah, of course. That's maybe where he's been regarded most positively over the last 10 years or so, but it still feels like he's not really competing at the elite level, right? He never challenged for the Serie A title, the Scudetto. They were never challenging for the Champions League. They didn't even qualify for the Champions League when Mourinho was there. And then it's Fenerbahce, where didn't have a lot of success, was more known for the controversies he was involved in over the matches and the trophies that he, rather than the trophies that he won. And now it's back to Portugal as Benfica manager, and we'll see how that goes. But it does feel like the last 10 years of his career, he's just sort of been drifting, looking for something to spark that old magic that I am not convinced is ever actually coming back at this point.
Yeah, it's a question. He seems to think it will be, now that he's back at a proper club with proper ambitions. The Fenerbahce one is so confusing in hindsight, but in the moment it was like Roma didn't work. Like, he is no longer in demand. United didn't work, Spurs didn't work. I mean, Chelsea didn't work, United didn't work, Spurs didn't work, Roma didn't work. Where do you go from here? And I think, I enjoy some Turkish football. It felt to me like, he's going to be a god. They're going to ensconce him. He's going to get whatever he wants. They're going to spend the money he wants. You can spend less in Turkey, theoretically, until Victor Osimhen goes there. You can spend less to get more and to be stronger. And I thought that was going to be him winning everything and then using that to catapult back, so that the narrative had to switch to, actually, Turkey is corrupt and Fenerbahce don't know what they're doing. And it was never the league for me. It does feel like another blemish that's going to be hard for him to correct. I did not see him getting the Benfica gig, which I think speaks to the instability at Benfica more so than the desirability of Jose Mourinho in the present day.
Yeah, I thought his next move would be international football. Yep. I mean, he speaks openly about wanting to coach the Portuguese national team. And the cynical read of him taking the Benfica job is that he's positioning himself for that to be nailed on. Of course, it could backfire if his time at Benfica is a disaster. But I will be shocked if Mourinho isn't Portugal manager for the next World Cup. For 2030, I think he will be the national team manager at that time. So I think that's what his future looks like. But yeah, I mean, there's always that bit of me, maybe this is just me, Taylor, for all that the last 10 years have been tiresome of Mourinho, I can't shake the first 10 years, man. It was magical. For the charisma, the quotes, the exhilaration of seeing him going up against the best and winning. So I still have that slim hope that maybe at some point it'll just click for him and we'll see the old Mourinho, but I'm not holding my breath.
Any player or manager that can make you hate them for what they are able to do with your opposite, but at the same time be super jealous of what they're able to do, I think that speaks volumes about how good they are at what they do. And that was Jose Mourinho for me. It was Like, at the time, a Manchester United supporter, Sir Alex Ferguson's still in charge, and yet I'm looking across sort of slightly jealously to, like, who's this young guy who's, like, very charismatic and charming and clever and annoying everybody but also winning everything? He seems like he'd be fun, and I hope we get Fun Jose again, because Fun Jose is best Jose, even when Fun Jose is also angsty and annoying Jose to many.
Yeah, I mean, he was the first true embodiment of the cult of the manager, right? I think that's why he feels like such a significant figure in football, because obviously managers had been a big focus before him, but he felt like the first real celebrity manager. He had sponsorship deals separate to the clubs that he managed. He was in commercials on TVs. He was in the front of magazines. You know, he was a bit of a sex symbol as well. So he was a genuine celebrity in a way that would then be a precursor for the likes of Pep and Klopp and the era that we're still in, where there's just so much discussion around managers. I think you can trace a lot of that back to the fascination around Mourinho. That fascination, of course, still exists to this day, hence why we're doing this episode.
Graham Ruthven, thank you very much for doing this episode with me. I very much enjoyed a walk down the Jose road. It's been lovely.
Thank you, Taylor Rockwell, our very own special one. What does that make me? Someone in the YouTube comments called me bitter the other day, so maybe I'm the bitter one. Yeah.
The specially bitter one. I was going to call you the special one to close it out and forgot, and you beat me to it. Nicely done to you. Listeners, nicely done to you all for listening all the way through. For yet another week, we greatly appreciate it. I love me some Soccer 101. I love getting to talk out these strange, different episodes with you, Graham. We'll be back to, talk about random concepts or random leagues next week. But for now, thanks again for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.